Welcome, Dick Russell, to the JFK Facts podcast. A real treat to have you. I realized that, I thought sometimes I think an hour, to talk for an hour seems like a long time. And then I realized you're friends with Marina Oswald. We want to talk about that. You're friends with Rob Reiner. We want to talk about that. You're an expert on JFK. We want to talk about that. And you're very involved with RFK Jr. So there's a lot to talk about today. So if people don't know your name, you're not exactly a household name, not yet, I would say. Dick Russell is the author of 14 books. Do I have that right?
I think it's 16 now, actually.
16. Since I last checked a month ago. 16 books, which I would say several JFK books. The Man Who Knew Too Much, about Richard Case Nagel, and On the Trail of the Assassins, about District Attorney Jim Garrison, but a bunch of books about environmentalism. So, and you're very involved in a political campaign right now. So how do you describe yourself to people? What does Dick Russell do?
Well, that's a good question. I'm my interests are very eclectic. And I've written books on a wide variety of subjects that interested me, and been really lucky, blessed actually, to be able to publish and write about and publish what I love to look into. I mean, I'm an investigative journalist, going way back, both about the kind
Is
of
that
the environment.
Is that a common denominator of your books? Are these works of investigative journalism?
Well, yeah, I think the other common denominator is that my books always seem, I've thought about this lately, I'm looking to bring something to light that's been buried, or whether it's a psychologist, James Hillman. I'm his biographer, and he's somebody who's the founder of archetypal psychology, not that well known in this country as much as he is in Italy or even Japan, and even though he's American. And I ended up writing a 3-volume biography of this Jungian, post-Jungian thinker. Most people, he's been called the wisest man you probably never heard of. So, I don't know. It's kind of like that. Or I did a book called My Mysterious Son, which is about a memoir, really, about what I've been through with my own son, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was 17, and then how eventually I moved toward looking for some kind of alternative, or at least adjunct to medication. And so it's, the story of the subtitle is a life-changing passage between schizophrenia and shamanism. So those kinds of things, I guess, I would say, in addition to my work on JFK and the environment, is, what I write about.
Well, we had communicated most recently about Marina Oswald, and I had found this interview that I had conducted with her a long time ago. So you knew Marina a long time ago, and tell me, what do you make of Marina Oswald's story? I had sort of forgotten that I had talked to her, and I'd sort of put her out of my mind. And when I listened to that interview again, I was struck with many things, but pathos and admiration for her, and what an impossible situation she was in, and for somebody like her to be rendered voiceless. So tell me your impressions of Marina Oswald. How did you get to know her? What was your situation?
Well, I first started talking with her when I was writing The Man Who Knew Too Much, which was back in the early 1990s. And we had several phone conversations. And that's when she had really begun to want to get the case reopened, and to show that Lee Harvey Oswald, her husband, was a patsy, as he claimed. And so this was new for her. And I ended up getting to, having a relationship with her over the phone. And then she agreed to come to Boston, where I was living at the time, and speak at Harvard, as just answer questions from people there, which I arranged. And then also to have a meeting with a number of people, lawyers really, to talk about the possibility that maybe there was a way to reopen the investigation after all this time. So that's where I got to know her more personally, and she stayed with a wealthy friend of mine that agreed to bring her to Boston, and we had a heck of an afternoon at my home there.
and nobody could really come up with, what to do. And these were some brilliant legal minds. Was there a way to reopen the case in Texas, or have a Texas court of inquiry, or all kinds of things were kicked around, and it was concluded that basically too much time had passed, and she, I think, came away disappointed. That was the case. But I found her a really, as you said, there was a lot of pathos there, and also, I mean, she was a very sincere person. She was a mystic in a way. I mean, very interesting, background, and I came to like her very much, and I know that she told me some stories of what she went through after the assassination, where she was taken advantage of, I mean, really badly, by some people in the FBI, and she didn't speak English very well, and it was just a hell of a bad time for her.
Yeah. Because I thought that I was going to get another chance to interview her, I didn't ask some of the obvious questions. And I'm wondering if you ever talked to her. I mean, if I had gotten another interview, which I fully expected to do, I was going to ask her, so what was the process by which her mind was changed? Because, obviously in 1964, she goes along with the official story, and it's very easy to understand why. I mean, she's living in a foreign country. She's got small children. She's not going to rock the boat in any way. But after she moved on to another life and remarried, what did you ever get a feeling for her of how that process worked for her? How did she come to change her mind?
I don't, she did tell me, she said, I was a walking zombie in those early days. She was such a mess, and didn't understand what was going on. All kinds of people were manipulating her to say certain things, and she was afraid to reveal anything that might point to Lee's innocence. But I think with the passage of years, I mean, she began to get to know other researchers. I think she knew Mary Farrell and in the Dallas area, and came to realize there was a lot more that she didn't even have any idea. I mean, I remember she told me that she said Lee was not an innocent, bystander in all of this. That he was a, maybe he was a double agent or a triple agent, or she didn't even know, but she knew that he had intelligence connections. And that the photographs, I remember she told me that were the famous backyard photos that she took of him holding the rifle. She said those were faked. That what ended up being revealed was a different rifle. She said it was basically a fiction, and so I found that quite interesting, to say the least.
That she had taken the pictures, but the pictures she took were not the pictures that were
exactly
were in evidence.
Yeah. And I think in recent years, she hasn't really spoken out hardly at all since you interviewed her, and there was 1996. I brought her to Boston in 93 on the 30th anniversary. So I think she's just, she's obviously around 80 years old now, and just not wanting to continue to, what I think she feels is beating a dead horse.
Yeah. Who can blame her for retiring?
Exactly.
From the field? I guess so. A second hat that you wear these days is you're maybe the chief researcher for Rob Reiner and Soledad O'Brien's JFK, Who Killed JFK podcast, or maybe not the only researcher, but maybe researcher in chief. So that podcast has been very successful. It's reached a very wide audience. A friend of mine called me and said, Jeff, they're talking about JFK on Barstool Sports right now. like the story had reached a whole nother, range of people who, wouldn't normally talk about it, and they're interested, and Rob somehow, got into their conversation and they got into his. So how did the podcast come about? How did you hook up with Rob and Soledad?
Yeah, well, it started in actually some years back in 2016. I had a friend in the film business named Matt George, who some years before that had been involved with he's from Australia, and involved with a researcher from there who was interested in making a movie based on my book, The Man Who Knew Too Much. It's fascinated by the story of Richard Nagel, which we can get into a little bit if you want to, but he was kind of the main character in my first book, which came out in 1992. Anyway, his name was Matt George, and he had, by the time I reconnected with him, he was very close to Rob and working with Castle Rock, doing different films. And so we had lunch one day, and he said, you know, Rob is very interested in the Kennedy assassination, which I had no idea. And he'd like to do a film, but he thinks right now that it was just the mob that did it. And he said, I don't think that's true, and you don't either. So I'd like to set up a meeting with you and he. And so he did. And I met Rob in the summer of 2016 at his home, and he and his lovely wife, Michelle. And by that point, he had heard about the Richard Nagel story, which began on September 20th, 2 months before the assassination, with him walking into a bank in El Paso, Texas, asking for American Express traveler's checks, turning away, shooting 2 holes in the wall of the bank, walking out to intentionally get himself arrested. And, you know, he had in the trunk of his car a notebook with notations for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, phone number of the Cuban Embassy in Mexico City, very similar to Oswald. So the idea, the drama of that moment was something that really appealed to Rob. So anyway, we set out to make a movie, actually a series that evolved. They hired 2 screenwriters, David Hoffman, who ended up being the writer on the podcast as well. And then another fellow, Ken Nolan, who'd written Black Hawk Down. And we started doing a lot of research and talking to studios. We went out in the field. We made a big trip to Dallas together. Met up with one of the people that ended up in the podcast also, named Tosh Plumley. Interviewed, went to the Oswald boarding house. Interviewed people there, and so we were doing a deep dive on additional research at that point, and it looked like it was going to go forward. The one studio said, "Yeah, we will do it," and they were going to do a 10-part series where the scripting ended up being sort of my story, the journalist going out there in the 1970s and interviewing all these people. I was really the first investigative journalist to do that in the 1970s. So I spent like 2 years writing articles for the Village Voice and other places about when the investigations were going on in the Congress, the House Assassinations Committee and so on, and Church Committee. So anyway, it looked like we were going to go with a 10-part series, and the first 2 scripts were done. And then suddenly the first studio that said they were going to do it, they just backed out. And
no explanation?
Nope. Just they decided it was not going to happen. And so then Rob went to a lot of other places, eventually through, I think, Warner Brothers, and nobody would touch it. Even though the scripts, they said, oh, they were very good, they're really excellent, but I don't think it's really for us. So
what does that tell you, that a guy like Rob Reiner can't find anybody?
I was surprised at first, even though what I concluded was that, and this may sound conspiratorial, I don't really mean it that way, but that the media, the media in general, the big media, and that I would include Hollywood studios in that, have always been, certainly, we were going to posit that this was a conspiracy. There was involvement by the CIA, the mafia, and Cuban exiles working together, and the right-wing military and General Charles Willoughby and the oil people like H.L. Hunt. And we were going to come out and say this. And the big media has never wanted to investigate this right from the get-go. I think they probably got egg on their face after all this time, because it's pretty clear that something happened differently than warned.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't speak for Hollywood, but for East Coast media, for elite media, which I've spent some time in. Yeah, I think the egg on the face thing, it's like it's too big a climb down to say actually, we kind of got that one wrong.
Yeah,
So,
I think so.
and I guess, that Hollywood, attentive to politics and mass opinion, as they have to be, is probably following the same rules. So how did that turn into a podcast? Was that?
Yeah, so well, Rob and I were born the same year, so he's slightly older than me by 6 months, but we were, in high school juniors in high school when the assassination happened, and we were both he earlier than I, but very, very affected by it. And so, I mean, I wasn't particularly until the mid 1970s, but Rob was really on it after he through Mort Saul, who he knew, and through his family and everything, and so he was still wanting to pursue this in some way, and decided let's go for a podcast. I mean, I didn't know anything about podcasts really, and anyway, iHeartRadio expressed some interest, and then okay, so who would be the good host for this? And so Rob thought, why not Soledad O'Brien? And he didn't really know her, but I think it was his idea to reach out to Soledad. And so we started working on it, and it turned into like a 10-part podcast series.
Yeah.
Where we could really dive deep, and interview some of the people we already interviewed for the movie,
Right.
series. Yeah, so it was in the works for more than a year, and and David Hoffman, I think, he's a young script writer that Rob had sort of discovered.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, the first thing I was going to say was the writing was really excellent. I mean,
it really was,
and the podcast is a unique art form.
Yep.
The kind of the reassuring repetition to remind you where you were, the transitions. It was really nicely done. I mean, and I think that's one of the reasons why it spread so wide, was because it was a very agreeable, accessible conversation.
Exactly, which was a discovery for me, and I really ended up enjoying. I didn't think I was going to be a commentator in this necessarily, but I ended up being that.
Yeah.
So it was great fun too, doing lines, because it was all scripted.
Yeah.
It was not ad-libbed.
Right.
So David wrote the script and we read the script, and it was all based on fact.
Right.
But so I would, it was fun to read lines with the pros, I mean, I really.
Yeah, no, and Rob, Rob has some really good line, this wasn't an investigation, this was a fait accompli.
Yeah.
Exactly. Really summed it up nicely,
Yes,
and very, very succinctly. I also liked his explanation of how covert operations work through cutouts and people that he calls CIA adjacent. That's a very that's a very good phrase for Ruth Payne and Priscilla McMillan.
Yeah, exactly. And
George de Mohrenschildt and
and I think we were all pleasantly surprised at how successful the podcast was. I mean, I think 6 million downloads, and for a while there, it was not just the number one crime podcast. It was the number one podcast in the whole country.
Yeah.
People, and so what it showed, I think, was that there was still a tremendous amount of interest in what Rob rightly calls the greatest murder mystery of all time.
Yeah.
Not solved, and so there's, what more can we reveal and find out, and so that was heartening to know that there's a younger audience out there too that still finds this really compelling, and that something went wrong that day, tragically, terribly wrong. We've never recovered from as a country.
We debated a lot on JFK Facts, your final episode, the 4 shooters, and this was the one part of the show that I had some hesitation, some reservation about. So tell us, I think people will be interested. So how did you come by the 4 shooters? What, give us a little capsule summary of the people you think were in Dealey Plaza or might have been in Dealey Plaza.
Yeah, well, one of them, and I think maybe the one you and I agree is the most compelling. And we did not say that these were definitely the shooters. I mean,
right.
This is a hypothesis based on research that
right.
likely these people could have been there.
Right.
But one of them was a Cuban exile named Herminio Diaz Garcia, and I had come across. Well, there was reason to believe that, going back to Richard Nagel, who I spent a lot of time with in the 1970s, he had spoken always of these 2 Cuban exiles who called themselves Angel and Leopoldo, the same names of 2 Cuban exiles who brought Leon Oswald to the doorway of Sylvia Odio in Dallas in September '63. But, and he would never tell me who they were, but he knew who they were because Nagel had been involved with them as a double agent for the Russians and the Americans. Don't have time here to go into all that, but anyway, Angel was almost for sure, and this was verified by the Cuban intelligence guys at a conference in Nassau back in '96 or '94, somewhere in there. Nagel would always say, "Why can't Tony Cuesta come home?" He'd always, when I bring up Angel and Leopoldo and who they were and working with Oswald, he'd always refer to Tony Cuesta, who was this exile leader of Alpha 66, Cuban exile group that was very close to the CIA. And Cuesta was taken prisoner.
Okay, let me just say one thing because we have a lot of sticklers there. Tony Cuesta was head of Commandos L.
Yeah.
Alpha 66. Commandos L was an offshoot of Alpha 66.
Alpha 66.
Just want to be precise because people will nitpick. So yes, Herminio Diaz.
Yeah. So anyway, very likely he and the Cuban government put him on the grassy knoll or somewhere in that vicinity as a shooter.
Yeah.
Documents that the CIA released only in recent years show that all of a sudden the CIA was really interested in him around the time Richard Nagel walked into that bank and sent a warning letter to J. Edgar Hoover before that. They're completely overlapping in September of '63 with Nagel's movements. So anyway, Diaz was one person and he was a known assassin. He killed a guy back in the 1940s. He fit the physical description of Angel. So I think that, he's a likely candidate. Maybe you say something about it too, to have been directly involved.
Yeah. Well, I talked to Fabian Escalante about this, and he recalled the interrogation of Cuesta. Cuesta was captured in 1966 in a raid on Cuba, a raid in which Diaz was killed.
Right.
Tony Cuesta was blinded. So in the prison hospital, they questioned Cuesta about what they were doing. And Cuesta, because he was blinded and helpless, cooperated and was just hoping to get sent home, which eventually they did do. But Cuesta said, this guy Diaz, people said he was in Dallas that day and he was involved in the assassination of Kennedy, and that, everybody around him, like Cuesta, that, they weren't there. They didn't have firsthand knowledge, but they believed it to be true. That he had played that role. So that's not airtight evidence, but it's pretty strong.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's one. And then another guy that we named was Jack Cannon. And that's not a name that's come up very much.
So tell us about him. Who was he?
All right. Well, he was someone that Nagel kept hinting at. He was a known hitman also. He worked directly. He set up a unit in the Far East back in the early 1950s under General Charles Willoughby, who it was called Field Operations Intelligence, top secret unit. You can go be court-martialed for even mentioning the name. Nagel was part of it, and so was this guy Cannon. He was the head of something called the Z Group, and Cannon eventually ended up in Texas, and he was continued to work directly for Willoughby, and he was
there was a Russian book came out and saying that the fatal shot was delivered by the Z group, by a guy with this particular organization. And so putting just two and two together, and believing very strongly that Charles Willoughby was involved in the planning, at least, of the assassination, and very close to the Hunt oil family and to the right-wing Cubans. I put Gannon there as a good suspect.
Okay.
Also, Charles Nicoletti was a third person. He was a mob hitman. He was working directly for people like Giancana. He was in Dallas that day. A fellow named Chauncey Holt had him, brought him in a car. So he was another one. Jean Swetre was a French hitman who was deported, and we didn't know this until the mid-1970s, but he was deported from Dallas 48 hours after the assassination. And he was definitely there. He used two aliases and had worked very closely again with Cuban exiles, with Willoughby. So bringing these people together is that's the best we could do at this point in time.
Right. So you're saying that these guys were all known to be hitmen. They were all in Dallas. You're not saying they were all firing a gun at the same time in Dealey Plaza, are you? Or
well, that they all did or were recruited to do that without knowing each other.
okay.
This was a compartmentalized operation, so it's not like they were all talking on the same team before they went in there.
Right.
I don't. So in that sense, yeah.
In the course of the podcast, at the end, and I think in the 9th episode, you talk about, and Rob says, really the identity of the people who organized it is more important than the identity of the gunmen. And you named 4 names, which will be familiar to a lot of our listeners: James Angleton, the chief of counterintelligence; Bill Harvey, the former chief of Cuba operations; and David Phillips, chief of Cuba operations in Mexico City.
Right.
And then you also mentioned Willoughby, who is less well known. So give us a little bit on Willoughby, and then let's talk about these 4 men as a group.
Willoughby, Douglas MacArthur, he was MacArthur, the general, obviously from the Korean War and World War II. Willoughby was his chief of intelligence, and MacArthur once called him my little fascist. I mean, he was a very very well connected, extreme right wing person. This quick curious story, how I found out about him in the first place was back in 1975. I published my first article about the assassination in the Village Voice in New York. And I got an anonymous letter after that saying to me, and it was little block, somebody pasted it together. There were no computers back in those days. And saying, you are now part of the great game and trying to solve the assassination of President Kennedy. And he said, our Canadian computers pointed out a man named Adolf Sheppy Wiedenbach, born in Heidelberg, Germany in 1897, something like that, as being the mastermind of the assassination. He concluded by saying, if you want to know more about this, put a classified ad in the Village Voice saying, Brooklyn waiter, I'm waiting, and I'll respond to you. Well, stupidly, in retrospect, I did not do that. I thought, who the hell's Adolf Sheppy Wiedenbach? The name was absurd. And so I did not follow up. And years later, actually, my then wife, we were doing some research together for The Man Who Knew Too Much, came across the fact that that Adolf Sheppy Wiedenbach was the given name when he was born in Germany of Charles Willoughby, who changed his name when he came to the United States. So I started looking into this guy, Willoughby, and I was shocked to see all these connections that he had. And he lived in Texas at that time, had this thing called the Foreign Intelligence Digest, was connected to former Nazis in Spain, Otto Scorzini.
So he's not active duty in 1963.
No,
he's a political
he's a political actor. He's retired by then,
Uh-huh.
and living in Texas. He died in 72, I believe. So in my book, I laid out a whole thing about Willoughby and how this came to be, so yeah, I mean that's who he was. And then Angleton, I interviewed Angleton on 3 occasions
Mhm.
when I was doing this research in the 70s, and I found him quite a fascinating figure. He was, for some reason, wine and dine me at the Army Navy Club in D.C.,
Uh-huh.
drinking his martinis, and then he'd drop little hints along the way. And I mean, but basically, I mean, because I was nobody. I mean, I was a writer for the Village Voice, right? I wasn't with the New York Times or any of these places. But anyway, he did see me. He was gone from the CIA by then. He'd been exposed as having this whole domestic operation that was illegal for this under the CIA's charter. But anyway, he was definitely trying to point in the direction. He said, "We'll never know the truth until we get the files from Cuba and Russia, because they were involved in this whole thing." He was adamant about it. And as time went by, it became more clear through research by yourself, among others, that Angleton was quite a likely candidate to have been involved in the assassination of the president, and worked closely with Phillips and Harvey, who especially Harvey was just known to hate JFK. And
Yeah. When you talked to Angleton back then, did you think that what you think now, that he might well have been involved in a conspiracy to think the president? When you were talking to him, what did you think?
I thought, yeah, I mean, I kind of did, but I mean, he was certainly not gonna. I mean, he definitely knew. I mean, I remember we sat one night at dinner, and he says, "Well, you can't write this down, but I know who killed Sam Giancana." I said, "Oh, really? Who was that?" And then he points the finger away from the CIA and at the mob, right?
Right.
Same thing with Jimmy Hoffa. He said, "I know where Jimmy Hoffa's body is buried." I said, "You do, huh?" Well, I mean, it was crazy. He dropped these little tantalizing hints. But I think I remember the one part that really shook him was that it had just been revealed that Mary Meyer, who was now known to have been JFK's mistress at that point, and had been married to Cord Meyer with the CIA when Kennedy was having an affair with her, that when she was murdered on the towpath of Georgetown in 9 months after the assassination, around the time the Warren Commission came out, that Angleton and Ben Bradley of the Washington Post went into her home and found her diary, and they made off with it. And it was when I mentioned Mary Meyer to him that Angleton blanched. I mean, this was already public knowledge. It had been published in, I think, New Times Magazine. And he was very, very nervous about discussing this. So there was something there that, interestingly, that Soledad O'Brien ended up doing a big podcast series on
Mary Meyer. Yeah. Yeah.
Before we did this one.
Right.
So, anyway.
Then you talk a little bit about in the podcast about Bill Harvey, and one thing that I didn't know until I wrote my Angleton book was, I thought of Harvey and Angleton as kind of separate ends of the CIA, and they different personalities, different social class, but in fact they were quite buddy and worked together, especially on assassination operations.
Yeah, that's right. And Harvey was, after he was fired by the Kennedys, for his outrageous actions during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he ended up going to Rome and being the chief of station there, and that was, kind of a hotbed area where you could recruit assassins easily from Italy or from France, and through people like Scorzani, that could happen. And Harvey definitely would be in fact, I don't think you were told that he was in Dallas that day, right?
Well, that was David Talbot reported that he was seen on a plane flying into Dallas.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Shortly before the assassination. Yeah. you in the podcast, you quote from a Harvey memo that I thought was really important about the reaction inside the CIA to Kennedy's resolution of the Bay of Pigs, which was basically that this had given sanctuary to Castro.
Yeah.
And I thought that really defined their reaction. The world might have sighed in relief that there was no war, but inside the CIA, this was a self-inflicted blow that benefited the enemy.
That's right. Yeah. And of course, Dallin Dulles and Charles Cabell were fired over that at the end of that year.
Yes.
And, Dulles, before that, it was sacrosanct. He was like, his brother was Secretary of State all through the 50s. And he'd been there at the beginning of the CIA. And of course, it's interesting, too, that Cabell's brother, Cabell was deputy director under Dulles, who got fired. His brother was the mayor of Dallas, Earl Cabell, who, as we now know, because it just recently came out in some of the newly released documents, was an asset of the CIA. So he's in charge of Dallas, when they set up the motorcade. And so there's some very mysterious coincidences here.
Yeah. So how do you envision if these men were, basically conducting a covert operation to assassinate the president and blame this on Cuba? How did they come together, and when do you think they decided this? And, I know this is speculative, and I always hate it when people ask me these questions, but I'm going to ask you, how and when did an operation to assassinate the president come together, do you think?
I think certainly talk of it would have begun right after the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that would have been the fall of '62, so approximately a year before. Because that was when JFK agreed, to basically not invade Cuba, not continue trying to kill Castro, taking our bases out of Turkey, our military bases out of Turkey, and basically, in the eyes of many in the CIA or the DIA or the branches where there was some very extreme right-wing attitude, I guess you'd say. They felt Kennedy was betraying the country, that he was siding with the Russians. He and Khrushchev, they probably found out, had a back channel communication, because those two leaders realized how close we'd come to nuclear Armageddon. And by the summer of '63, JFK gave that great speech at American University. I mean, we were moving toward, which outlawed nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, testing of them. So there was a huge change afoot that was leading us, in a much more of a peace direction than had been possible during the Cold War. And that would have included Vietnam. JFK was going to pull the troops out of Vietnam. So for all those reasons, there were people that really thought that was a treacherous act and that he had to go.
Yeah. In the one of the final episodes, Rob uses the word coup, which is a very strong word, and not one that many academic historians in the United States would agree with. Not the least because it's the word that Oliver Stone used all the time. Oliver was blasted and criticized and is still demonized, 30 years later. Rob, on the other hand, has seemed to have gotten a free pass compared to Oliver. What do you make of that?
Well, partly I think it's Rob's charming personality. I mean, he can say something like that and it doesn't come off as heavy-handed.
Yeah.
And it's more the result of, the podcast was very meticulous. There were 10 episodes, not 10 hours, but, 45 minutes each or 35. And it was, sort of moving step by step through the cover up by the cover up of the war by the Warren Commission and what the House committee concluded, and then the forensic evidence and how that it just shows unequivocally, there had to be more than this guy Oswald shooting, and then just moving along to trace what happened and sort of build the interest and the mystery and leave little doubt, I think, in a lot of people's minds after listening to it, that it was a coup, in the sense that the elected president of the United States was taken out, was murdered by a cabal within the United States. It wasn't the Russians.
In a struggle over policy.
Struggle over policy, over power, and where the country was going. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. It was a coup.
Yeah.
And but for the elite, or the powers that be, or however you want to put it, in the media, to come out with that, well, what would that mean? I mean, I think it would mean that, wow, we got to question some things that have been going on for the last 60 years, and what the result of that was. And what does that mean when you can overthrow that's what we did to governments all over, Guatemala and Iran and a lot of other places. The CIA was overthrowing governments and killing people. And I'm not saying the CIA per se killed Kennedy, but certainly that was a mindset that existed. And it calls into question a lot about where our country has been, for all this time. And we're not the American exceptionalism is kind of, we're above all that. We take care of problems in other countries, but we don't do those kind of things here. And I think this shows that that's not necessarily the case.
That's a very good way to pivot into the present and politics today. So among your books, I don't know if the first book I saw, but after I read The Man Who Knew Too Much, I saw that you were co-writing books with Jesse Ventura. At the time, he was elected governor of Minnesota as an independent, and then you did On the Trail of the Assassins, which in a lot of ways turned into Oliver Stone's movie, which kind of gave voice to Jim Garrison, and told his story. And then most recently, you're now very involved with RFK. You've written a campaign biography of him and a new movie, The Real RFK Jr. So now I realize, like, you're not just a writer, but you're kind of like not a ghost writer for these political mavericks, but somehow you give them voice, or you align yourself with them. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's not quite accurate in terms of what you say about Garrison. The book On the Trail of the JFK Assassins, Garrison's was called On the Trail of the Assassins. That came out before, but
right.
So Oliver Stone's movie happened before I wrote that book, the
right.
second you're referring to.
Right.
But in terms of the others, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I met Jesse Ventura by accident in Mexico. Turned out he had a place just purchased down the road from where my extended family has a place. So we got to know each other there and ended up writing books together because we had a lot of common interests, and he was convinced there was a conspiracy to kill JFK, and so I worked on his memoir with him, and in the course of that, introduced him to Bobby Kennedy, who I knew independently because he and I had environmental causes that we worked on together, and I'd written articles about him and featured him in a book on gray whales and another book on striped bass. So our interests were, I never even talked to Bobby about the assassinations for many years. I mean, I didn't even bring up that I'd done this book.
Really?
Because our relationship was completely different. But he did meet Jesse Ventura, and I've recently written about the strange coincidence or synchronicity that when they met and went diving together in 2005, Ventura suddenly said to him, "Do you want to run the country?" And Bobby flustered, "Yeah," but Ventura said, "Well, then quit the Democratic Party and run with me." So he actually invited him to run with him as an independent candidate. But this before Obama came in. At the time, it was Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton, and so that didn't happen. But recently, I introduced Ventura. Now I've stayed in touch with him. We wrote 5 books together, and so he now has a winter place in Tucson, he and his wife. And when there was a recent event there that RFK Jr. was doing, I introduced him to the crowd because I had introduced the two of them many years before.
and they had a great time together. We sort of in a reunion there together. So anyway, yeah. So I don't know how much. I mean, I knew Bobby for many, many years as an environmental advocate. Had very common interests. We loved to fish. We became good friends. And then I wrote the biography of him before he declared for president. I mean, that was not in the cards. I started working on it because I was just really pissed off at the fact that, he was being so denigrated by the big media and being called, anti-vaxxer, crazy, all these things that I knew weren't true. And I felt like, I want to write a book that will give a picture of the guy and his environmental achievements and why, he's doing this. And it would, before he went, eventually he told me, I guess a month, I was working on the biography and I was out at his house interviewing him a lot. And he told me that he was going to do this. He was going to run for president, initially as a Democrat, which he announced a year ago this April. And so suddenly the biography took on a bit of a different dimension. It didn't really change what I was doing.
But it didn't start as a campaign biography.
No, not at all. It started as a book to just show who this guy was, and because he was a friend of mine, and I knew that he was being vilified by the media, the big media, unjustly. So set out to do what
watching the movie, The Real RFK Jr., based on the book, which you narrate, and tell his story. And a couple of things are very striking about it. Very candid and open about his personal difficulties with addiction, obviously the tragedies in his family. You don't dwell on it, but you say it's presented as this is the human condition, and so many of us have been through it. And there's something candid about that posture that he's taking that is a little different than what we usually get.
Yeah, I mean, certainly different than, I mean, my belief is that you can imagine what he went through after his father's assassination and following his uncle's assassination.
Yeah.
And he was a mess. He was a 15-year-old kid, rebellious. It was the 60s. Psychedelic drugs were happening, and he ended up becoming a heroin addict, and was an addict for many, many years. Very high functioning one. Then he almost OD'd on an airplane in 1983, and that was really the turning point in his life. I mean, because he went into rehab, discovered, and still is part of AA to this day, and was very willing. In fact, took me. I went to an AA meeting with him, and he really wanted this, not overly emphasized, but he wanted it told in the biography because he'd really been there. He'd been to the bottom, and it was what compelled him into the environmental arena and changed him. And he's changed so many people. I mean, he's helped so many people through similar things. And I thought, today with what so many parents are facing with the fentanyl tragedies that, their kids are being killed. He's somebody who's been there, and I think in a way that no other candidate, certainly for president, could address these kinds of things and help people out.
Yeah. The movie also, I think, makes clear, and in the early moments, and how you come into the story, is that the story of his uncle's assassination is almost fundamental to what he's saying. That something really did go wrong back then, and something irretrievable. And it's not something he talks about a lot, but when it does come up, he's quite forceful about it. And it strikes me that that's a real strength of his campaign that so many people agree with him, and across the spectrum, liberal, conservative, moderate, independent. The polls show the belief that Kennedy was killed by his enemies is really pan-ideological. It's not concentrated in any part of the political spectrum.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And of course, Bobby Jr. has worked across party lines for a long, long time on environmental issues. He didn't care if you're Republican or Democrat. He just wanted to, get the toxics out of the river, and he'd go wherever he could get some help, get a watershed agreement, and so on. And I think that I know that for years it was as I said, it was a subject that I didn't want to bring up with him because his family obviously pains a lot of them. They're all of them really, and they didn't want to go there, and neither did he for a long, long time. He read Jim Douglas's book, JFK and the Unspeakable, which is a terrific book, especially as it frames the situation that JFK was in at the time, and why certain powers wanted him out.
Yeah.
And that book really opened his eyes. And then he got it to Ted Sorensen, who had been his uncle's speechwriter, and Sorensen had never wanted to go there either. He read that book and he thought, wow, yeah, something happened here.
Yeah.
And so there was a shift, and Bobby began to really investigate what went on, as he's a lawyer, and he started studying his uncle's and then his father's assassination, and coming to things that were painful for him, and a lot of his family didn't want to go there. And he ended up even visiting Sirhan in prison, which some people probably know about, and that was really upsetting to a lot of his family members. But he spent time with Sirhan and, advocated for his parole, which the parole board in California had approved. I'll just say briefly about that there's no way that Sirhan was certainly in the pantry. He certainly shot people, but his bullets did not hit Senator Kennedy. And he was shot from behind by a security guard. But that's been, it was so clear to so many, well, Sirhan was there, he must have done it. But, he's not innocent, but he's been in jail for years with no memory, I should add, of a crime that he didn't actually fully commit.
Right.
So Bobby took these on, and he's been talking about this publicly, and he finds, it resonates with a lot of people who know that the leaders of America during that time, there were 4 great leaders, were all cut down by not the same people, but by the same force that changed the country irrevocably, seemingly, from what it might have been in those years, coming out of those years.
Yeah. I'm undecided. I'll tell you, as a voter, obviously not happy about, like a lot of people, the choice between Biden and Trump. But very concerned about the authoritarian ambitions that are quite naked on the part of President Trump. So, wondering what's the best way to prevent that from happening. So what do you tell voters like me who are, I'm very open to some things RFK Jr. says, especially about war, that why are we always at war? We're heavily involved in 2 more wars. Why do we have that? He questions that. He doesn't think that's inevitable. That's attractive. Some of the COVID stuff, I have a hard time accepting. I know he's wrote an article for Rolling Stone and Salon, but Joan Walsh, who I know at Salon, said that was a very difficult and disillusioning experience for her working with him, and that she didn't find him credible on the autism question. So, I think I'm typical. I'm open-minded, haven't ruled anything out. I don't buy the conspiracy theorist discourse. I think that's, a shaming discourse designed to discourage debate, not encourage it. So what do you say to people like me?
Well, what I say is that, I think we need a drastic change in this country. That the system that exists right now has been corrupted to the point that, through people like Trump, our democracy is in danger of even surviving. But this has been going on for longer than Donald Trump, and it involves more people than he. And certainly we don't want him in there again. I don't.
Yeah.
But, I honestly think that RFK Jr. will take more votes away from Trump than he would from Biden if it's the 2 of them running. Because a lot of Republicans, I did Jeff, after my biography came out, I've done probably 50 radio shows and podcasts with different people interviewing me. And most of them, I'm almost all of them, have been with so-called, right-wing shows.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fascinated by that. I consider myself to have a Democrat, certainly. I'm a progressive but I found that these guys were really open to who Bobby Kennedy is and what he represents, not just because of his family, but because, he's so smart and he's been willing to take on issues that nobody will take up. And he really is a fighter for the people. He was inspired by his father. He can go out into the Black community and the Hispanic community and Native American reservations. His father took him to reservations all the time when he was a kid. He has that feeling for the middle class, for blue collar people that is very sincere. And he's not just some, talk off the top of your head, liberal. And he considers issues and listens to people. And, so I think that he's the guy we need at this point in our history. We're at a major turning point. If something doesn't change, I don't know what's going to happen to the country. And so I am, even though it is a tremendously difficult task for an independent to get on the ballot, there's a big team of people working to make that happen. And I think if you can get on the ballot in all the states, the polls are showing, the recent poll that NBC News did showed that 34% of people they talked to said, yeah, I would consider supporting this guy. Well, that's right, even with Biden and Trump. But if he's not on the ballot, that's not going to happen, obviously.
Right.
So that's what I guess I would say to people in a nutshell.
So you think he can win?
I think he can. I actually think he can if he's given a chance.
Right.
He didn't want to leave the Democratic Party. I know that. But they made it so difficult for him, to have in the primaries and to have any shot at having, any kind of support. That he told me this, before he did it again, he says, I think I've got to go independent, and I don't want to do it. I've been a Democrat all my life. My family's Democrats. He said I think that's the only way I can possibly have an impact.
And what were the obstacles in the Democratic Party route?
I can't remember all the specifics, but one was that the primaries were going to happen, like in New Hampshire and the caucus in Iowa, and he would have been up against Biden in those, and they were making it really difficult in South Carolina and others too. They did the same, some of the same tactics that they used with Bernie Sanders back in 2016, because he was considered too radical. And so, they weren't going to let him into the debates if they could. They were just going to do a series of things that make him pay for voters that he took away from Biden. There was some crazy stuff that he had learned about and finally just decided, I can't, there's no way. Mm-hmm. And so he declared his independence with a campaign slogan that continued to be heal the divide, that we're so divided now as a country, and who's has a chance to really do something about it? He thinks he can. So, he's going to certainly give it a shot to get in there. And I think he's got a chance if he can get on the ballot. A good chance.
Well, that's a good place to end it, Dick. Thank you very much. The Case for RFK Jr. from Dick Russell, author, environmentalist, political strategist even. I was thinking, Dick, you were kind of like, you're to RFK Jr. like what Axelrod was to Obama, kind of.
Well, that's very flattering.
I
don't know.
The calm, wise guy in the background. Good luck to you. Your books I recommend them to JFK Facts readers. Both of your JFK books are very interesting. And of course, the podcast, which also reflects your work and many other JFK research, is also a good statement of the case. So thank you, Dick Russell.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to talk to you again.